The Grand Assembly Hall of the Velkara Empire had never been quiet. Not in 400 years of continuous session. Not when wars were declared. Not when colonies were lost. Not when species were stripped of their voting rights and cast to the margins of galactic civilization. The hall hummed with the constant undercurrent of political machinery, translators clicking, advisors whispering, the soft percussion of clawed feet on polished obsidian floors. But today, it went silent. Not gradually. Not in the way silence usually crept into large spaces, room by room, voice by voice. It went silent the way a cliff face goes silent after an avalanche, completely, suddenly, and with the weight of something that could not be undone. The human had fallen. Riven had been standing at the central podium for 43 minutes. He was the sole human representative present. Earth's diplomatic corps had been reduced to one after the Empire's bureaucratic restructuring had quietly eliminated 3 of their allocated seats. Riven had not complained. Complaining was not something he did. He had simply taken the single remaining seat, opened his briefcase, and begun preparing for the fight of his planet's life. The matter before the Assembly was simple in its cruelty. The Empire wanted to reclassify Earth as a Class C resource world. It was a legal category that sounded administrative. In practice, it meant no voting rights, no territorial protections, no legal personhood for its inhabitants under galactic law. It meant, in language the Empire preferred not to use out loud, that humans would become property. Riven had known this going in. He had prepared for weeks. He had memorized every counterargument, every precedent, every procedural vulnerability in the Empire's case. He had stood at that podium and spoken with the calm, methodical precision of a man who understood that his words were the last wall between 8 billion people and erasure. He had been in the middle of his third major argument. The legal inconsistency between Earth's classification and that of the Doran Collective, a species with half the technological output and a quarter of the cultural documentation, when his voice stopped. Not paused. Stopped. His hand gripped the edge of the podium. His knuckles went white. Then he went down. The hall did not process it immediately. The Velkara dignitaries in the front rows assumed it was a rhetorical technique. Humans were known for unusual performance choices. Several advisors made notes. One representative from the outer rings leaned toward her aide and murmured something about dramatic timing. Then Riven did not get back up. That was when the sound began. It started from the Eastern Observation Gallery, the section reserved for non-voting attendees, diplomatic companions, and species not yet granted assembly access. The section where, by a procedural footnote that no one had thought to challenge, a small group of Keth cubs had been permitted to sit with their diplomatic guardian. The Keth were a species that the Empire had long considered beneath serious attention. Quadrupedal, covered in dense gray fur, with oversized eyes and vocal ranges that spanned frequencies most species could not consciously hear. Adults were reserved, careful, politically invisible. They had learned to make themselves small in the presence of the Empire. The cubs had not yet learned that lesson. The first one, the smallest, barely to Riven's knee when standing, let out a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a cry. It was something older than language, something that did not need translation. The others joined within seconds. 5 cubs, pressed together in the gallery, their small bodies shaking, their voices rising in a chorus that bypassed every translation filter in the hall and went directly into the nervous systems of every creature present. The Keth grief call, in its juvenile form, carried frequencies that triggered involuntary distress responses in over 60% of known sentient species. The assembly did not just go quiet. It froze. Liara was the senior Keth diplomatic guardian, and she was already moving before the echo of the first cry had finished bouncing off the obsidian walls. She crossed the gallery in 4 long strides, dropping to her knees beside the smallest cub, wrapping her arms around the shaking cluster of small bodies. But she did not silence them. She could not have, even if she had tried. And she did not try, because she was Keth, and she knew what the sound meant, and she knew it was true. She looked up at the podium. At Riven, still on the floor. Medical units had appeared, Empire standard, efficient, entirely impersonal. They were moving toward the podium with the calm urgency of machines completing a task. Liara stood. She was not a diplomat. She held no voting access. She had no legal standing in this hall under any classification the Empire recognized. She spoke anyway. "You will stop the session." Her voice carried. Keth adults had precise vocal control. They could thread a single sentence through ambient noise with surgical accuracy. Every translation filter in the hall caught it and rendered it into every active language simultaneously. Supreme Arbiter Davrin, who had presided over the assembly for 16 years without once being interrupted by a non-member, turned to look at her with the slow, deliberate attention of something very large and very old deciding whether a small thing was worth its time. "The session will resume when." "You will stop the session," Liara said again, with exactly the same inflection. This man was speaking for his people. He fell while speaking for his people. "You will not continue," as though that did not happen. The cubs were still crying. The sound moved through the hall like water through stone, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the patient insistence of something that could not be argued with, only waited out. Davrin's mandibles clicked together twice, a Velkara gesture that indicated genuine calculation. Non-members are not permitted to address. "He came here alone." Liara's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, each word placed like a stone in a wall. Earth sent one man, to stand before the full assembly and argue for the survival of 8 billion people. He stood here for 43 minutes. He fell. And your first instinct was to check whether the session could continue. Silence. The medical units had reached Riven. They were working. Liara did not look away from Davrin. "The Keth have sat in this hall for 60 years, she said. "We have watched. We have been patient. We have followed every rule, observed every protocol, waited for every recognition that never came. And in 60 years, I have never seen a species send a single person to fight alone for this long." She paused. "The cubs are not wrong to cry. You should understand what they are telling you." The session was halted. Not formally. Not with a procedural vote or a recorded motion. Davrin simply did not call the next speaker. He sat with his great head lowered, his compound eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, and the hall remained still. It remained still for 11 minutes. When Riven was stabilized, cardiac event, treatable, human medical technology already on its way, one of the junior Velkara archivists quietly accessed the session record and noted the stoppage. Cause of delay, non-member address, Keth diplomatic representative. Reason accepted, assembly conduct under review. It was not a victory. Not yet. It was a crack in a wall that had stood for 400 years, hairline thin, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But Liara had been Keth long enough to know that walls did not fall all at once. They fell the way silence fell, in small moments, accumulating, until one day you looked up and the wall was simply gone. Later, when Riven was conscious and the room was smaller and quieter, the smallest cub crept onto the medical cot beside him and pressed its forehead against his arm. Riven, who had given 43 minutes of precise legal argument before his body had simply refused to continue, said nothing. He put his hand on the cub's head. The cub made a small sound, not the grief call, not the howl that had stopped an empire. Something quieter, something that did not need translation either. Liara stood in the doorway and watched and did not speak, because there was nothing left to say. The assembly had halted. The wall had cracked. And 8 billion people still had a voice, because 5 small creatures had refused to be quiet, and 1 woman had refused to sit down, and 1 man had stood at a podium until he could not stand anymore. That was enough. For now, that was enough.